Okay, today I get the great opportunity to talk to somebody whose work I've followed for a long time. And I followed his work because he is very influential in the monome community, and he's a very active participant in the Lines community. And many of you have heard me rant about how much I love the Lines community. And so it is with great honor that I am going to today get to talk to Scanner Darkly. Hey man, how's it going?
Good. How are you?
I'm great. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to get a chance to talk to you today. This is really fantastic.
Thank you. Likewise.
Well, I originally reached out to you because Brian Crabtree, when I went out for a visit, he kind of said, there's somebody you have to interview for your podcast. You have to talk to Scanner. And I was like, okay, a little intimidating. But so I reached out, and I really appreciate you kind of taking the time out of your schedule to have this chat. For people who might not be part of the monome community or may not know your work, why don't we start off by having you talk a little bit about what you do?
Sounds good. So, I've done quite a bit of, work with the monome devices, developing alternative firmwares and also contributing to some of the code base for Teletype, Ansible, and so on. I guess this all started back in 2015, actually with a different module. It was NW2SB module, Arduino Duo-based module developed by Scott Wilson. When he released it and I read about it, what appealed to me was the fact that you could program it yourself, and
Right.
me being a developer, that was something like maybe the first time that I saw that I could actually apply my coding side to my music side of things, because they never really interjected before. So
Right.
This was really interesting to me to be able to do something myself. And because the code base was open source and Scott posted several blog posts describing how you can program your own stuff, it was really easy to start. So I kind of gave it a try, and as is tradition for me now, I usually start with writing a Conway's Game of Life app.
Right.
Because Scott added support for monome grid right from the start, and with the grid, it's very natural fit for the Game of Life because you can it matches it visually, and
Right.
you can also the fact that you can actually influence it directly yourself with a touch. That was just being able to affect the civilization with your hands. That was I thought that was very cool. I also did a simple app using monome arc controller, which was, I think it was called binary arc, and it was actually based on Blasted binary zone module.
Okay. Yeah.
I thought it was a really interesting concept where you have several clock dividers, and you basically add up those gates and it generates a sequence. So it's kind of, I guess, like additive sequencing in a way.
Oh, interesting. Sure.
And then, so with the arc, the fact that you could just manually change those divisions or shift them around, that was also there was this very hands-on aspect of it that I liked, very playable aspect, and that's kind of how it all started. I think I joined the monome community around the same time, and I've heard many things about it before. Was always curious to find out more, but it seemed a little intimidating. And I finally got a grid, I think, just like in 2015, back in 2014, 2015, and tried several Max apps, and then. Monome released a line of modules for their first Eurorack modules, White Whale, and so on. Since it was also open source, I thought, okay, I'll give it a try, see if I can make some modifications or just play with it a little bit. And because it supported ARC, which wasn't originally planned for Eurorack modules, I guess.
Right.
Like I don't know if Brian had it in mind, but because the library already supported it, and I just kind of plugged it in and just let's see what happens. So I remember just playing with the source code, and I got it to the point where I had all of the LEDs blinking on Arc, and that was it. And it was like this breakthrough moment that I made an LED blink. Compared to what I have now, it's like it's fun to look back and think of it as that starting moment.
Right. Well, but when you talk about what you have now, it's actually a pretty broad array of stuff. So you went from making some light blinks to actually doing full-on alternative firmware for those initial modules, right?
Right. Yeah. So that was Orca was my first alternative firmware that I did for the monome white whale module. Not to be confused with the live coding
Right.
Orca done by 100 Rabbits. It was just the extension of that initial idea for binary arc based on the binary zone. So I thought, okay, so if we can, have this just like this thing that generates sequences, because I already had it running on NW2S B module, I thought I can just port it to white whale and see if it works. Mm-hmm. So it worked, and then it kind of like, okay, let's see what else I can do. And then at a later point, it was like, well, what if I add grid support for that as well? And it just kind of all happened very quickly in the span of maybe like 2-3 months. I had a full working app.
Interesting. And then, what did you do after that? Because that's when you started really getting attention in the community. First of all, so I know people were just like nuts for the Orca firmware. That really excited people.
Yeah, I think for a couple of reasons, because there wasn't anything that used monome Arc at that point.
Right.
So I think for a lot of people that already had Arc, they could finally use it with their Eurorack systems. To me, I think maybe some of the recognition that I got for that is not really fair, because to me it's the toolchain setup for the firmware development. That's what takes a bit of effort, right? And then just kind of figuring out how things are set up and how things are connected. How do I, generate a CV? How do I process button press? So once you kind of figure those out, I think it's much easier to just develop the actual app, because it's that initial overhead of learning how to do simple things that takes quite some time. And I think that's why it was a bigger deal than it should have been, really. And I think a lot of what monome does to me is simplifying this very thing. So it's about making it easier for people to just write an app without having to think about all of the technical details, technical aspects of it.
Right. That's absolutely true. And there's probably no place where that's more true than with the, from a module standpoint, than with the Teletype, which is this very intriguing but minimalistic programming interface. Now, that's something where you have gotten very deeply involved in the firmware development for that, right?
Yes. More than I actually anticipated originally. I kind of just helped with, smaller things here and there. For me, it's actually when it was just released, my first thought was, it's going to be so much easier to develop apps for it because it has a screen. I can actually make it print something that will help me find bugs. Because there were times when, I have a bug and I didn't have a debugger set up, which you could also use with modules, but I just never had it set up. And so quite often it would be, try one thing, flash firmware, try another thing, flash it again. And I'm probably the person on the planet that flashed the firmware most. I've done it, I don't know how many times. I've gotten so good at it that I can just do it like in a matter of seconds.
It's muscle memory, right?
Yes, exactly. So with Teletype, it was a really different beasts. It took some time to wrap my head around it and just like all of the possibilities. I find that actually a common theme with monome, that like it takes time to kind of like process how is it going to fit, how am I going to interact with it, what I'm going to be able to do with it.
Right.
So with Teletype, it was the fact that you could write your own apps, but it's right there. You don't have to do anything extra. You don't have to upload anything. It's right there in the module. It's very immediate. And one thing that I loved about Teletype was this what-if mentality. So it's super easy with Teletype to, you write one line of code. Let's just generate some random CV. Then you go like, okay, but what if I, use the knob to control the range of that CV or something? So it's very easy to just kind of take off from that initial idea and just go in different directions.
Right. Well, and not only just within its own hardware, but through the implementation of I2C, it's kind of become the heart of a kind of a whole digital talkie world. I mean, in addition to working with Ansible and with the original modules, it also will talk to things like the Mannequin's Just Friends, the ER301 sampling computer that everybody's in love with. It really has become kind of the heart of a different kind of digital music making environment.
Yes, indeed. At one point I had this idea of like Teletype just being sort of this preset management system in a Eurorack modular, because you could totally have it control various other modules, as you mentioned. But I kind of envisioned at one point building this system around Teletype where pretty much almost everything would be controlled from Teletype itself. So it would become the kind of like the central control center for the system. You could use it as a very simple module, kind of like a replacement for very simple modules like a gate delay, right? And I think that's totally fine too, because that's the beauty of it, that you could just, like, you patching something, you don't want to be thinking too much about how to do something, and you say, okay, I need to do this. I want to generate random voltage when these two gates are high. So then normally you would be thinking, okay, I'll need to use this module and this module, which I don't have. With Teletype, you kind of just do it, right?
Right.
So I think there's some perception that Teletype is this thing that you're supposed to use for only very complex things, like, some really advanced sequence generating scripts or something. But I think it could be that, but it could also be just a very immediate thing that just fills that void in your patch.
Sure, that makes sense. So I have got a whole bunch of questions I want to ask about that and about your process of working. But before we do that, I want to talk about something that has kind of become a core of my podcast. I like talking to people at the background and how they get to stuff. And I'm particularly curious. You have a very thoughtful approach to being a designer of this musical hardware firmware stuff. And that's really cool, but it seems like you come at it from a very artistic place as well. And I'm curious about your background. Where are you coming from that drew you into music and music making? What are you doing? How did you become kind of like technically proficient? And how do you mold all that stuff together to be the person that you are?
I've heard somebody also describe it that way, that I usually approach, even when I do demos of some of the firmwares that I'm working on, I always try to approach it from a musical point of view, and I don't want to I don't want to read too much into that, because that's like, I know that can be a hot topic as well. What's musical, what's not? Not to say that my approach is any more musical than any others, but yeah, I always try to put it into the perspective of how could it be used within the musical context, right? It's very easy to make some app that does something, but I always tend to look at it in a way that, okay, but how is it going to be used? How is it going to be integrated with other things? It's almost treating it when you pick up a new instrument and you have to kind of figure out what does it do, how does it work, how do I speak to it? So same thing with apps. I find you don't program an app that just does something. you do, but then you have to kind of start also learning from it and just play with it. And you can have, you can plan ahead, and you think you'll have everything just perfectly set up and perfectly programmed, and then you play with it, and it's kind of like, no, this is like I keep hitting this side, or I like this really is not. Like it's not providing me the effect that I thought. So it's a process where you play with it, you listen to it, you make changes, and it's like this mutual process of like it's telling you how it works, and you trying to sort of shift it towards where you see it, like how you see it working. It sort of reminds me of my firmware Orca sequencer, because it's kind of a sequencer, but it's also a generative tool, right? So you could use it as either, you could program exact sequences with it if you wanted to, but it's really painful, and that's not what the best use of it is. The best use I find is just kind of, you play with it, you hear something, and you just kind of try to influence it. And you might feel some resistance because it says, no, I don't want to go that way. No, it's not what I'm doing at the moment. So you have to actually learn to talk to it, and then you develop this feel for it, where it's like, okay, I think if I do this, it's going to do that, and then it does, and you know that you understand it better at this point.
Right.
To get back to your original question, so coding was something that I've always been interested in since I was a kid. My siblings were interested in it as well, and so there were some books in the house. And I remember reading a book on assembler for fun. I really enjoyed it, actually. Didn't have any computers until I was probably 16.
Okay.
I mean, growing up in a small town in Russia, that was the case, and I had a programmable calculator, I think. So that was my only access to something where I could actually program something. And music also was always something that I was interested in, but again, looking back, I didn't have a recorder, so I think that's kind of limits what you can do, because if you can't sort of record and iterate over, it's much less fun.
Well, and it's harder to share it.
Yeah, exactly. And I had a guitar, I think, and I kind of tried to learn that, but that was it, right? So I was more interested in electronic music, and there wasn't really anything that I could use to do that until much later. So interestingly enough, those two things kind of never overlapped, coding and music. They were separate things until I started doing this firmware development.
That's really amazing. What kind of coding do you do? What had you learned to become a coder?
So if you mean in terms of daytime job,
yes.
I do work as a software developer, and it's much more, your typical enterprise cloud-based stuff. It's much bigger scale, and things are quite a bit different in approach, and it's .NET and C#, all of that. So we've been using microservices and cloud-based solutions and so on. So it's all pretty interesting, but it's also very different from the firmware development in a way that was what really, when I started, when I did that first firmware for monome, White Whale, it was that immediate fun. It's quite different when you're doing it for work and you write a feature, then eventually it goes out into production. There's a very big disconnect between when you write a line of code and the impact it makes. It's much more immediate when you write a line of code and it makes an LED blink, or it makes it makes a sound. You press something, it makes a sound.
Right.
It's much more immediate. It's much more there's a lot more satisfaction doing that. So that was kind of when I started doing this firmware development. I was like, oh, I remember, how fun it used to be to just do coding for fun. That's what I kind of liked.
Sure.
I mean, people ask, why do you do firmware development? And I always say that the first reason that all of us do it, all other people that also participated in developing for Teletype and other firmwares, SAM, so on, it's because we like it. It's because it's super fun.
Right. Well, and it's an appreciative community too. The community really does embrace, not only embraces people who do the coding, but also embrace the code that's generated. Sometimes I'm around communities that they're really open to having developer tools, but everybody's so focused on doing their own programming that they never look at anyone else's work.
Mm.
And there's something about the monome community that everyone's like, "Oh, you made that thing? Yeah, I'm going to take it and give it a try." It seems to be really kind of like always excited in that way.
Right, right. And but I also like the fact that what Brian's been doing is moving towards enabling it for more people, right? Because
Hmm.
as I mentioned, like doing Orca back in 2015, it was seen as a bigger deal because the toolchain setup was difficult. But
Right.
I think like it creates this sort of impression that what you do is a thing that only a few people can do, and I don't like that. I think that anybody should be able to write apps, and like it shouldn't be seen as like some black magic voodoo thing.
Right, right. So one of the things I'm curious about is from the standpoint both of access to musical equipment as well as access to computing equipment. Things really have changed a lot since you were growing up in Russia. Clearly, to what extent did having that scarcity when you were first starting and first interested in stuff, to what extent has that had an effect on what you do now? I mean, do you like hoard instruments because you missed having them, or are you like not now comfortable not having a lot of music making gear because you never really had it, so you don't worry about it? I mean, how has that kind of shaped your perspectives?
Oh boy, I would love to have some of the tools that I have now, to have them as a kid.
Yeah.
I can't imagine the impact it would have on me, or just what I would do with it. So yes, looking back, I don't know if it was a positive thing that the scarcity of it, if it actually made me appreciate it more. Yeah, I don't know. But yeah, I would say in terms of equipment now, it's much more around the things that I can program. That's sort of my driving force now. It's a lot more interesting for me when I can just take something and just do something with it. Like, so I've got an instrument, and I did a game of life app mod for the instrument firmware, because that's the first thing that I do. And
Right.
so and now instead of learning how to actually play it, I am thinking what other apps I can do with it. So
Yeah.
that's kind of what drives in terms of gear purchases. And
Does that ever worry you? Because I have to admit that I have some of that in me too. But then sometimes I start worrying. It's like, how come every time, so I got a Norns, right? A mono Norns. And it's like,
mhm.
how come every time I want to play music, I end up getting sucked into programming the Norns? Maybe I should allow myself to do that and say that it's okay. But I tend to worry about the fact that it draws me into programming instead of allowing me to play music, right?
Yeah, I had this misplaced notion at some point that, oh yeah, like all of this thing that I am doing, like great teletype integration, it's all to get me to this perfect setup that at some point I'm gonna
You'll be
have where
done.
it's, yeah, and it's like it's a super custom setup, like it does exactly what I needed to do. And I would get to that point, I would have something assembled, play with it for 5 minutes, and then be like, okay, what else? Like what else can I develop, right? So it's, yeah, like, it's exactly the same thing as you described. It's more like I just realized at some point I'm not the kind of person that, like, I'm not building a setup for myself. I'm much more interested in just making things that can be used, not
Interesting.
using
Yeah.
them, I guess.
Right. Building things for the community. I guess, though, if you think about it, it's a different kind of. I mean, if you think of music always as being sort of oriented around this idea of releases, releasing
Mhm.
an album of music or whatever, in a similar way, doing the kind of work that you do in terms of firmware and stuff, that is sort of like your own version of releasing something into the public. Your fan base is going to wait anxiously to be able to get it, and you'll get a lot of feedback as a result of that work.
Right. Yeah. So, and that's a good point. Like, because you could just keep changing things, right? Like I could keep developing Orca, and I did, and I think at some point it became overdeveloped and had too many features, and people complained that it was too complex. And I get that, because I think it goes back to, like you have to listen to the instrument
Right.
as well, and kind of cut off things that don't contribute to its nature. You kind of have to figure out what is it that makes it interesting, and sort of try and concentrate that in the most efficient form. Or
No, I totally get it, because especially when you're working with tools that kind of from a physical interface standpoint are really limited. So like you started by working on the white whale hardware, which was, a couple of jacks, a couple of knobs, and a USB port that connects to a grid, or in your case, an ARC. You have this process where you have to take this, you have to almost have like a mental funnel where you take all the 50,000 things you would really like to do and kind of winnow them down to the things that you could do with just those few knobs and the things that you could do with just those jacks. And then also say, and I can extend these ideas because, there's a timer here, so I can take advantage of that. Sort of like this annealing process. And it's what you talk about where you say you have to let the instrument kind of come out of the code. But there's also an initial stage where you have to say, I have a million ideas, but I only have 3 knobs. So I have to make appropriate decisions. What does that look like for you?
It's interesting. So I've been starting. I've been playing with VCV Rack plugin development lately, and it's funny because it's much easier to add a knob if you need an extra knob. It's very easy to do that. So it's like the exact opposite of developing for fixed hardware,
Sure.
which I find an interesting change from before. But so I am actually porting my Orca sequencer to VCV Rack right now, and I already changed it a couple of times because, like, the first idea was just to kind of have a pretty close match to the, to what I did for White Whale. But then it didn't work out, and then it also, the fact that, I could easily add a bunch of CV inputs, and I could actually influence the algorithm with the CV, put it under modulation, which you can't do with White Whale. So that kind of like, okay, I didn't really think of this aspect of Orca before, so what can I do with it? But then you also get to the point where, okay, and now it's 50 HP, and I really have to zoom out to see all the jacks, and when I do that, I can't read the labels anymore, and so maybe it's time to kind of scale back and think, do I really need the 20 CV inputs and 45 knobs? So yeah, I think VC Rack is kind of providing a good way to also kind of like test this, like how do you take something and distill it into a more pure form, right?
Right. Well, now when, like with working, starting off with the White Whale, at least you had some knobs and stuff like that. When you moved over to work in a Teletype, that'd be a different experience because it's really oriented, it's kind of jack oriented. It has one knob and only one CV input. The rest is all gates. Did you have applications in mind that you wanted to do it? Or was it more that you wanted to take the concept that Brian had started and take it further?
It was the firmware, the hardware was the fact that it had more inputs and it had more outputs compared to White Whale, and it had a display. So the display for me was it was, I think at that point I actually kind of, it was too much. I couldn't think of like, what can I do with this display? There's just so many things I could do, and I couldn't really think of anything that would use that platform to its full extent. So, and then Grid Teletype integration happened, so that kind of took over any ideas that I had for like an fully alternative firmware for Teletype.
Right.
So it kind of steered me towards more contributing to the original firmware rather than developing something else.
Right, but that firmware that you've helped out with, I mean, there have been some pretty extraordinary additions. What were some of the things that you specifically were involved in adding?
So the grid teletype integration probably is the biggest one of them. Took me over a year to work on that, and it's funny how things start with a simple idea, and with grid teletype integration, the idea was, well, what if I just plug grid into Teletype and see what happens, because it uses the same code base as White Whale. So the support was there. It was more of, okay, but so first of all, will it work? Because there are always things that, okay, maybe I didn't think of this or that, and there are some limitations. And I think I actually messaged Brian and I said, will I damage anything if I do that? And he said, no, I think should be fine. And I was like, okay, I think I might have actually plugged it already at that point. Because I'm just gonna try it. And it was, back to that first moment where you make an LED blink and it's like, I got this working. And I didn't really think, okay, but what can you do with that, right? So, as we talked about, I always kind of try to see, okay, this is a great idea by itself, but in practice, what would it do for Teletype to have a grid support? What can you do with that? The original idea was actually just simply being able to trigger scripts or do something like that. Like you press a button and trigger script one, whatever.
Right.
That was all I was planning to do. And then just kind of thinking about it more, and at one point, what was the aha moment for this was, what if you create grid controls, like grid buttons and faders with Teletype ops? So then the whole UI becomes programmable, and you use the scripts themselves to create this UI. So you could actually create custom Teletype apps in a way using the same Teletype language that you already know. And I think, like, for me, the attraction there was that anybody could create their own grid apps very easily using Teletype. And not only that, but you could have different apps and you could switch between them easily because, it's all just scripts, right?
Right. So for people who do know the Teletype, one of the things that's kind of like an extreme limitation is that the scripting language that you write in has only so many, it's basically there's like 8 scripts or like 10 scripts you can write, and they can only be 6 lines each. Yes. And so for me, I never plugged my grid into the Teletype simply because in my mind, I couldn't figure out how I could do anything with the 128 buttons when I only have about 100 lines of code total to be able to work on, or if not even 60 lines of code, right? What did you do in order to make the coding efficient on the grid when you're working with a language as limited as what the Teletype had?
Right, so that was probably one of the biggest challenges for that, because, and also, initially thinking, exactly what you described. Is it actually going to be practical? So, okay, you can, make an LED light up, but then you have 128 of them. What can you actually do? So, I created ops that allow you to create multiple controls at once. That was one of the things. And also the fact that, you can create a button with just one op, I think opens it up quite a bit, because like you could have a script that sets up, 128 buttons in a loop. So your whole grid is already taken care of. So you could do like an Earthsea style keyboard on Teletype with probably 2-3 lines of code.
Okay.
But it was also just kind of trying and creating like those initial apps and just to see, okay, what can I do with it? So I did a couple of like pretty advanced scripts that only utilized maybe 10 or 15 lines of code. And that was, I think, the first time when I thought, okay, now this could be actually used for some pretty serious developments. It's not just kind of like, oh, okay, yes, I can
You
press a
can
button
do it,
to do
right?
this.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So,
Interesting.
and I think that was also because I suggested to Brian that I was thinking of adding this grid support, and I think he was pretty skeptical at first. And then I showed a couple of things I tried, and Brian was like, well, like, can't believe that, it only took 15 lines for that. So,
Yeah, right. So now, kind of the next step for the mono community has been the Norns, which I really loved working with. Have you played around with Norns much?
No, unfortunately, and that's really the limitation is free time.
Oh, really?
I've got Norns. I made one script for it, I think, just to kind of try it out. It's been sitting on the shelf since then. I do plan to go back. I've been actually learning Lua properly, going through the studies and so on.
Right.
And I've got a couple of ideas that might involve Norns as well. Don't want to disclose too much. It's like I first want to make sure that that's actually something feasible, but
Okay. All right.
it's something about possibly expanding Norn scripts to other platforms as well.
Oh, wow. Very cool. So the question I have then is, you talk about having kind of free time issues, which,
Yes.
but at the same time, the world has kind of changed for you. When you first started getting into this, the things that Brian and the mono community is doing was among the few music making tools where you could have access to a tool chain and you could create apps for it, right? Now, you've already mentioned a number of environments, and there seems to be a new one every day, where it's either a desktop-based modular system or a hardware module, or it's a thing like the Linstrument that's it's a full-on computer in a playable device. There is a new tool every day, and there is this sense now that people realize putting a programmable interface out there for people to play with might draw in a more interesting set of users. How do you find yourself now looking at this wealth of opportunity and decide which ones you even want to bother learning to program?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question because, when I started with monome, just doing the alternative firmware for White Whale, it was interesting because it was something that I've never done before, and to put my own code into Eurorack modular, that was super exciting for me. And then I did, after grid Teletype development and so on, doing, Earth-C implementation for Ansible. At some point, as a developer, like first and foremost, you do it for yourself because it's fun. You love coding, that's why you do it, right? But it's really incredible to see people actually use it and make music with it. So at some point, I just kind of realized that I want to have a bigger impact, and the Eurorack platform, or like specifically monome modules, it's really a limited number of people,
They're able to, yeah, right.
And not to say that it makes them obsolete or anything. I'm actually I think that with all the latest stuff with Teletype, Norns, and so on, the original monome Eurorack modules kind of, people kind of forgot about them maybe in a way. And when I did Poly-Earth-C, one of the ideas was to actually do something that will also run on those old modules. So, like, I don't like this, the fact that, we've got, it's very exciting time, because there's so much stuff coming out, so many new devices. It's super, it's great to see. But at the same time, it feels like it devalues them also, in a way. And I kind of hate that, because we've got this pretty powerful microprocessor in the Eurorack form that you could do some incredible things with. And we already moved on. Like White Whale, you could actually, there could be a lot more apps developed for it. There could be some really complex apps that you could develop for it, but it's not happening because it's kind of like, well, we already have other stuff that we could play with. for me, one way to maybe address that and to kind of move from this mindset of like I'm developing for this thing or I'm developing for this thing in particular is actually move from developing apps to developing platforms that allow you to make it easier to share ideas between platforms. Imagine like if you could take a Norns script and you could run it on White Whale.
Yeah.
Something like that. And the fact that in this case, the activity around Norns would actually transfer to White Whale as well, because you could now run it in Eurorack, or you could do something else. Or imagine, if you could run Norns scripts on the instrument. So you've got this direct integration with the controller itself.
Right.
You could then maybe integrate the pressure, sensitivity, and so on into Norns scripts. So something like that is where I kind of where my interest lies now, is developing something that would allow for that.
Well, this really sounds amazing. What are you working on right now that people are most likely going to see soonest? What of all the things that you're kind of juggling right now, what's the next thing that you're going to drop?
So the next thing is probably going to be my first VCV rack plugin, a module called Orca's Heart. So it's taking the Orca sequencer and kind of taking the main idea from it and putting it into plugin form with a lot more CV control, some other pretty interesting features that the original didn't have. It's I love the ease of development for this platform, so it's very fun to just try things, and hopefully that's going to be something I can wrap up pretty quickly. And then the next project is what I call multipass, so just like a simple framework that allows you to run same code on various hardware, like the old monome modules and so on. The instrument is something I really want to play with. Just the fact that it has Arduino Duo inside, you could actually write apps that would run right on the controller itself. You could just plug it into, digital, and you have a maybe generative app that you can affect with pressure or something like that. So those are kind of the main things. And I'm also working on a device called Enigma with Steven Reiko, known as Dinky Auto on Instagram.
Oh, yeah, right.
So we don't know yet what it's going to do exactly. It's a TNZ-based device that can talk various protocols, MIDI, I2C, serial, and so on. So don't know yet what's going to come out of that, but yeah.
Wow. Okay, so now I understand why it is that you worry about having free time. You shouldn't have free time. You need to take a nap, man, or something. It's crazy. But it also sounds really exciting, and I have to tell you that I appreciate the work that you're doing. It makes my music making more fun, and boy, if I wish that I could tell more stories like that, but I really do appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. That's great to hear. Thank you.
All right. Well, with that, I'm going to let you have the rest of your day. Thank you so much for your time, and we will talk again soon.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Many thanks to Scanner for having this great chat. It was really cool to hear about how he got into his work in the monome community, and all the other things that he's working on. Quite frankly, I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes out of his work with VCV Rack. But it was also interesting to kind of hear about how he grew up and how he got into the thing. It's kind of amazing now to think about having to learn about computer programming by reading leftover books from your siblings, right? Well, in any case, I want to thank him again for having the opportunity to chat with him about it, and I want to thank you, the listeners, for showing up again this week, listening, sharing, passing this along to friends. It really helps me feel a sense of accomplishment behind this stuff, and it really helps these people's story get out to the world. Thank you so much for helping. With that, I'm going to let you go. Have a great week, and we'll catch you next time around. Bye.